Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we return to 1980 for the first of Archie Goodwin's contributions to the Star Wars newspaper strips. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler, and while I say this is Archie Goodwin's first contribution, and it is, it's not one that most people would expect. A lot of people, when they think of Archie Goodwin in the newspaper strips, they think of what was eventually reprinted as Classic Star Wars by Dark Horse Comics, that 20-issue series. But that was not his first contribution. That was his first original contribution under his name, but not his first contribution. He also, right before those, would do a contribution called Han Solo at Star's End. Wait a second, that's a Brian Daley novel. Why, yes it is. His second contribution overall, the last one before writing those original stories, was to do a comic strip adaptation of Han Solo at Star's End. We're covering that in a future episode here on the show, and it was re-released by Dark Horse later on. But prior to that, he had one released not under his name, but which was an original story. So we have Russ Manning. Russ Manning gets ill. Rick Hoberg finishes up the Frozen World of Ota. Archie Goodwin comes in, not writing under his name. He writes under the name Russ Helm in this story's case. Then he writes under his name, but he's adapting Brian Daley. Then, finally, we get what we think of as the Archie Goodwin run on the series, which is actually longer than people give it credit for. So what was this story that he wrote under this pseudonym of Russ Helm? It's him writing with Alfredo Alcala doing the artwork. Remember, Russ Manning was ill. He left the series in mid-1980. Now is when Archie Goodwin comes in to pick up the series that is, in theory, going to be canceled very soon. Turns out it wasn't. We'll see more about that in that Han Solo at Star's End adaptation episode of From the Star Wars Library. This story is entitled Planet of Kadril, and there's not really a whole lot to it, but it is that unique item in the Star Wars publishing history in that it brings Archie Goodwin into this, whereas he at this point had just been writing for the Marvel series. Essentially what you have is the Rebel Alliance goes to the planet of Kadril, obviously, because they need some things called Kunda Stones. They're used in communications devices, in breathing apparatus, they're used for lightsaber crystals at times. They're very versatile crystals, and the Rebel Alliance wants to make a deal with the Kadrillians to get their hands on some. The problem is that the Empire is also there, Darth Vader representing them, to try to get their hands on the stones. They have this new device, or this new weapon called Passifog. It's essentially released into the air, and if you breathe it in, it sort of highlights your weaknesses and makes you more susceptible to defeat. And they want to use it. Problem is, they can't use it openly because, let's say you send out some stormtroopers into the Passifog, they'll be affected by it like anyone else. They need these Kunda Stones to help with the breathing apparatus in a stormtrooper's helmet, so the stormtroopers will not be affected by this weapon and they can use it against their enemies. Through some jockeying back and forth, a few action sequences in which our heroes wind up dealing with not only the city-dwelling Kadrillians, but also the no-civs, right? No civilization people. The no-civs, these Kadrillians who refuse to live in the cities and instead live in the outlands and in the caves and such. They wind up going back and forth until finally the rebels realize that these things are just too dangerous, and they use these, I think it's called a vibro crystal, these vibro crystals to essentially shatter the Kunda Stones. And by shattering them, they make them useless. And by making them useless, and they're the only things that can protect stormtroopers and such from the Passifog, in theory, this defeats the Empire's Passifog initiative. Although you would figure they could just put them in canisters of something and drop them into a populace without having to send in stormtroopers, in which case they could still use it without the Kunda Stones. Interesting how that's never really picked up much again. Suffice to say, it is sort of a quick little tale. It's a very self-contained type of tale, and it is introducing elements that we don't tend to see again. Kadril gets mentioned in some guidebooks. It gets mentioned in, I believe it's The Rise of Darth Vader, but otherwise doesn't really get mentioned anywhere else. The Kadrillians don't show up again outside of guidebooks. It's a very self-contained tale, not just in terms of its story elements, but also the things it introduces in terms of being used by other authors. It just doesn't tend to happen. The Kadrillians, for what it's worth, this is one of the strips printed out. The Kadrillians here are these sort of lizard creatures that you're seeing there. Very dull-looking lizard creatures at that. They always look like they're kind of moping around. It's like Eeyore done as a Star Wars lizard. You might also notice in this This is kind of one of my pet peeves of artwork. A lot of times when artists are showing female characters, especially in the 90s and onward, they always over-sexualize them, right? The men may be buff, may not, but the women almost always, they highlight certain aspects of their anatomy, like butt shots. Oh, the character's bending over, we must do a butt shot of this character. And one of the things that I found kind of amusing and somewhat odd in a recent story from Knight Errant, it was the last Knight Errant storyline entitled Escape, was that the artist constantly tended to be focusing on Kara Holt's chest. Not necessarily in a sexualized way, but every single shot, no matter what angle, no matter how far away, they always made sure to emphasize her chest. But it was done in a weird way where it didn't really seem like it was anatomically correct. It was just kind of emphasized. Same thing apparently has precedent here, as you view Leia here in her suit. Now, how does Leia's anatomy make her chest look like that? Is it possible she was hiding weapons inside the suit? Because that doesn't look anatomically correct either. But at least the artist from Knight Errant Escape can now say, well, see, there was precedent way back in the 80s. Yeah, it doesn't mean you should follow it. Precedent doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. Just means it happened first. Now, you may ask, why am I showing you a comic strip? Why am I not holding up the comic itself as I usually would? It's because this story was never collected by Dark Horse Comics. The Kashyyyk Depths was not, nor was Planet of Kadril. The Kashyyyk Depths, though, was never released on StarWars.com in the hyperspace area before it became the Dumbed Down Pretty Pictures website. In this case, this one was. So those who had hyperspace subscriptions could have read this as individual comic strips on StarWars.com for a while. Otherwise, it has not been re-released since way back when it was first released from, I guess what it was, August 11th to October 5th of 1980. So it's one that's sort of lost to history in a lot of ways, but there really isn't much to it to write home about from a continuity standpoint, so it's one of those that we usually don't realize that we're missing. It's just not something that is essential, which of course begs our regular question, is this an essential read? As I just noted, it is not. There's nothing about this story that is essential for future reading, future continuity, or anything else. It's just sort of there. But for those who want to see Archie Goodwin's first attempt at doing newspaper strips rather than full-length comic books, this is it, written under the pseudonym of Russ Helm. He's also having the art here of Alfredo Alcala. Alcala will also do the artwork for Han Solo It Stars in the adaptation before Al Williamson becomes the regular artist to go with Archie Goodwin for his mainstream run that we tend to refer to as Classic Star Wars. So, beginnings of some pretty good things here in terms of Archie Goodwin coming to the newspaper strips. Beyond that, not really much of note of this particular comic strip. That'll wrap up this tale in this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.